Hello, everybody. Welcome to the East Hampton Library. My name is Steve Long. I am the Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Tom Toomey series presented by the East Hampton Library and the East Hampton Historical Society. And before we get started, I just want to express special thanks to two people, Andrea Meyer, who's really been my partner in crime putting this Tom Toomey series together. I have had a couple of people who said, this is so terrific, you need to keep it going. Rest assured, we're going to be doing not only through 2026, we're already starting to plan the lecture series for 2027. And this would not be possible without the generosity of Judith Hope, who is here this evening. So thank you very much to Judith. I'm thrilled to introduce Alastair Gordon, an award-winning critic, curator, cultural historian, and author who grew up summering in Amagansett. For more than 20 years, he wrote on art, architecture, and the environment for the New York Times, as well as many other publications. Alastair is the author of more than 20 books, including the groundbreaking Weekend Utopia, Modern Living in the Hamptons, which will be the focus of his talk this evening. You're in luck. You can buy a copy of the book afterward. Buy a copy at the back of the room, bring it up. Alastair will sign it here at the front. And it has just been updated, expanded, and republished by Princeton Architectural Press on this, the 25th anniversary of its original publication. Please join me in welcoming Alastair Gordon.
Thank you very much. Nice introduction. Nice to see you all here. Thank you for the air conditioning of the East Hampton Library. Very appreciative. And so nice to see, as he said, I also want to thank Andrea. She did a great job in just coordinating all this and organizing this event. So, and it's wonderful. But I've seen some faces that I haven't seen in 50, 60 years, which is so nice. It was published in 2001, right before the original edition, which was kind of came out of my life growing up here in the summers. And my dad actually had been, our father, Ernest Gordon, had been the Presbyterian minister in Amagansett and Montauk originally. And then he got a position at Princeton, and we moved there. But so we always had this really, really intimate grounding in the place, not just with summer people, but we knew some really interesting, local Bonacker fishermen and farmers, and it was sort of kind of wonderful. So the dream this book kind of arose out of was this fantasy, almost like a Proustian memory of my parents' beach house in Amagansett. We grew up there. It was built in 63, 64. This is a little sketch that Andrew Geller did and in 1958, and I admired it so much that he actually gifted it to me. So it's one of my favorite kind of. This house was never built. It was just sort of his fantasy of the perfect escape beach house, which I have on the wall of my, I hang on the wall of my office. I'm not going to quote much from the book, but occasionally I will do a short thing. But this is just kind of a setup. The history of the modern beach house presented a uniquely utopian promise to a post-war generation who survived World War II and yearned for a more open and intimate connection to the natural environment. The promise of modernity was centered on the self, physical health, aesthetic refinement, doing more with less, and the idea of a radiant future that combined the best of the city, power, and cultural sophistication with the best of the country, nature, and peace. In 1963 and 4, my parents built a small modern beach house in the Hamptons, in Amagansett, that had a profoundly transformative impact on our lives. It became an emotional embodiment of our desires, a means of release and self-discovery. Kind of a happening, much like the music and subculture of the 60s. It was the smallness and simplicity of these summer retreats that forced one to experience nature firsthand, one-on-one, to learn tolerance and become closer, knit as a family. Those were the true rewards. So this is me, 1964. On the site, I've been swimming all day, I think. And they, my parents found this company, this started by an architect who went to the Bauhaus and MIT named Carl Koch. And I'm sure a lot of you know these houses. They were built in the 50s and 60s, called tech built. They were prefabricated. They were very affordable. I mean, my father was a dean at Princeton, didn't have a ton of money, but was able to buy land near Devon and build this house, which is just like kind of perfect. Again, the sort of the underwriting theme, the backstory of this book was kind of wanting to get back to that sense of innocence out here when it wasn't, so intense, when there wasn't so much traffic, and it was really about beach picnics and bunk beds and outdoor showers and just kind of simple living. And the title, because I needed to come up with some title that wasn't the same as every other talk I give. There was a great line by this guy, James Tanner. I don't know if anyone remembers him. He was a very successful journalist in the 50s and 60s. And he wrote about how, even then, in 1958, how the Hamptons were starting to change in a very unpredictable way. And he called it, the life of the prosperous Bohemians. These were people who knew about art. They were well-educated. They were friends with artists, but they weren't artists themselves. They were shrinks. They were real estate people. They were magazine publishers, book publishers. Very sophisticated urban types, and I'm going to try to kind of shadow on that a little bit if I can as we go forward, because that brought in new. So the artists came out after the war. Things were so cheap out here. Jeffrey Potter, who was a great source for all my writing about this period, said, no one could afford the gas to drive out here. You could take the train, but with the post-war rationing of gas, it was just too expensive. So it was so quiet and so inexpensive. Once all the magazines started to cover the artists, like Robert Motherwell. This is a photograph I took a week before the house was demolished in 1985. So it was in ruin. And in fact, Barney Rossett, whose widow is here with us today, nice. He was living in there, and it was supposed to be restored, and a lot of us got together and tried to save the house, and I tried to write about it a lot. And it was just it was that period when everybody was suddenly building these like English gentry, these huge mansions, shingle-style mansions. And it wasn't about, this is what kind of inspired me. I thought, wait a minute, when I was a kid here, there were always Maidstone, wasps playing golf. But there were also, it was a mix of artists and writers and fishermen and farmers, and it was that wonderful mix. And I think real estate forces that be just were trying to create this image of, as if it was Cap d'Antibes or someplace in England where you have these, very posh characters coming, hiding behind thick privet hedges, and they tune their driveways with that perfect, gravel so it crunches when their Mercedes drives across. I've always tried to figure out what note that is that's the perfect crunch, because it is. I mean, the really fancy houses have that. So this was 85, and we were and we were doing everything, and we even got a group saying, listen, we will move the house. Anyway, this is in ruin. It got torn down soon after that. Here's the coverage in the New York Times. They didn't really get it, but they covered it. Trend-setting Quonset hut is demolished on Long Island. But people around the world, because it was designed by Pierre Chareau for Robert Motherwell. It was not just a house, but it was a studio for Bob Motherwell, and also a little tiny cabin at the back where Pierre Chareau lived. The deal was, I will help you design this house out of this crazy recycled World War II Quonset kit if you let me build a tiny house for myself and my wife in the back of the property. So that was the payment. That was his payment for doing the work. And he lived there till he died. And Pierre Chareau is actually buried in the Catholic cemetery in East Hampton, which most people don't know. So if you want to do homage to Pierre, he's back there. This is just the kind of the evolution of the thing. It started because of that, the loss of that house. Helen Harrison, who was a wonderful curator at Guildhall at the time, we got together and started to pull together all these other examples, and do you have enough for a show? And I said, yeah, I think so. I think there are at least a dozen to 20. We ended up with about 50 or 60. So that was 87. Then we did another show. That went up to 1968 or something, and then we went from there up through the 70s. And the next show, in 1999, That morphed into a book in 2001, and then this today is 25 years later is the new version. So I basically, there's a lot of the same book in there, but it's all new introduction, a lot of new material. As soon as the book in 2001 came out, I had people coming, so many people coming out of the woodwork and saying, "Oh, I wish you'd called me, I had all this and that." So a lot of that I was able to pull in, kind of to recreate a period of maybe it's very nostalgic and utopian, but that's how history's made, I guess, right? How we remember it. This is the first show we did at Guildhall. We had William Muschenheim's incredible beach houses in Hampton Bays in the front there. Le Corbusier. On the lower right there, you see that casting, which Le Corbusier did, and was then, with Tino Nivola. I don't know where that is now. I think it's in a museum. That was then the later show. Jack Larson's wonderful rug made out of scraps of leather. The centerpiece was, of course, Charlie Gwathmey's house for his parents, 64 in Amagansett. To give a broader, slightly broader context to all this, at the time Long Island is this, we all know, it's kind of this strangely lovable but also terrible kind of place. It's so long and flat and narrow and it's a place where the Motor Parkway, which started with the Vanderbilts, paid for this private Motor Parkway that was supposed to go to Riverhead. It only went as far as Lake Ronkonkoma, and then Robert Moses, and that's his map, 1931, his vision. The dotted lines have not been built yet, but he had this vision of Long Island just being crisscrossed for the park system, which of course he was building, which is, with all the bad things Moses did, the park system is kind of amazing, and the parkway system. So Long Island was sort of like open, virgin territory for development, as Mr. Levitt said before he built Levittown. If a man has a roof over his head, he's not going to become a communist. That was his great line of, this is why we should support, And so if you were a GI, if you're on the GI Bill, a house at Levittown ended up being something like, I don't know, like $600 or something insane. Yeah, it really was. The houses themselves were quite a few thousand, but if you were on the GI Bill, it was incredibly affordable. So as this expansion of Long Island coming further and further eastward, you did begin to get, there weren't that many, but you did begin to get a kind of a modernist aesthetic. The Alvine House in Long Beach was part of this development. Alvine was a well-known producer at 20th Century Fox. And so he knew all these designers from Hollywood who were Germans and Dutch designers who were working on sets in Hollywood. Walter von Nessen, who was a famous modern, sort of modern Art Deco style more than modernist, classic Bauhaus. So all the furniture in the house was designed by these famous designers. I love this couple on the left there. I don't know who they are, but they did live in Atlantic City. Atlantic Beach was considered, it was called the Palm Beach of the North. So for a while, it was very posh for a while, and not for that long. But this couple were there. They looked very entitled, kind of angry, but you can imagine them at the in Southampton at this tennis club or something. And there were quite a few others like that, but kind of wonderful house. And then this is a big breakthrough because you have Percival Goodman, who I'm sure half the people in this audience may have known Percy Goodman, such a wonderful guy, and he had a place out here. He studied in Europe. He met Le Corbusier. He met Melly Stevens. He saw their work in the 1920s and 30s. He came back with all these wonderful kind of European socialist ideas about housing for workers, which is what the whole modern movement in Europe was about. It was about factories. It was about housing for factory workers. So he came back and he convinced a building company on Long Island in Long Beach to do this development. And then that didn't work out, but he did convince this Hempstead State Park Homes, whatever that was, to do a real subdivision. They built one prototype, and Percy's brother was Paul Goodman, the very well-known philosopher and social critic, and they said that it was so badly built, the contractors had sabotaged it because they didn't believe in a flat roof, they didn't believe in these cantilevers or these little porches. So Paul Goodman and Percy Goodman, supposedly like a scene out of The Fountainhead, came out and deconstructed the house because they were afraid they would be sued, that the roof would collapse. Great house. Great story, better than the house. Then this little community, which I wish I knew more about, near Northport, Long Island, called the Salonga Colony in Northport. And it was this guy, Coker and Frey, who were very, very successful. Frey had worked with Le Corbusier in Paris and came over. And they did this incredible house. The idea was a weekend house. The cars could sit underneath. There was just an exterior spiral staircase. The living room was on the main floor, and then there was the classic modern French roof terrace, which they considered a third floor. And anyway, it was extraordinary. Another house at the same little community that was built from two prefabricated kind of cubes. That had the first kind of modern house at the World's Fair of 1939, also on Long Island. Anyway, I just wanted to get through that part of Long Island to Eastern Long Island. This I had to put in because of the title of my talk, Prosperous Bohemians. These are not Bohemians at all. These are Maidstone club members at their cabanas. And I always, we did belong to Maidstone for a little while when they allowed the local minister to be a member. It's true. So we'd go there, but then my sister and I would go there quite often and be asked to leave and things like that. But most of our friends were members, and I loved the cabanas because that's where everybody had fun. That's where, you'd go back to these moldering big mansions and everybody got lost, but these little cabanas were wonderful. So there was always this sort of spirit of this being as close to the beach as possible, even at Maidstone. And this wonderful man, Frederick Muschenheim, I don't know if anyone remembers him, he ran the Waldorf Astoria. He was very social. He knew everybody. He was friends with Picasso and Braque and all these wonderful artists and performers. And he had this car specially built so he could hide. It was during Prohibition, obviously. And he would drive out from New York to Hampton Bays, to this estate he had with the champagne hidden and all the goodies from Waldorf Astoria, so that if the police stopped him, you can see them in this photograph, but there were panels that came down to hide all the food and the booze. And this was his son, who I got to know, luckily, before he died, William Muschenheim, who studied in Venice, Vienna, with Peter Behrens, who was one of the great early modern architects in Europe. And he won the Behrens Prize with this design for his father's house in Hampton Bays. They never built it, but he came back. He redid his father's house. His father bought the old lighthouse keeper's house in Hampton Bays. He redid it with these very modern European color theory. Interiors, beautiful, primary colors, and built this incredible, 1930. These are bathhouses, unlike the Maidstone cabanas. Very modern, very, very of the moment. And there were three kind of structures you see here. The one on the top was for the men. The one in the middle was shared because it was the only one that had plumbing. And so different times the men would have showers and the women have showers. And the bottom one is the women's changing area. And it was right on the ocean. Anita Zahn. How many people studied with Anita Zahn here? Yeah, we have 1, 2, 3. Oh, cool. Okay. She was, as most of you know, she was Isadora Duncan's disciple, came out here and started that school. This is early on when she was doing a performance on the beach. But Muschenheim, the father, was very close. I think they say the son said that he was lovers with Anita Zahn. I don't know if that's true. That's just mere gossip. I'm sorry if I pass that on. Don't repeat it. Don't let it leave this room. Whatever I say in this room stays in this room. Okay. So yeah, and that feeling of very much like Bill Muschenheim's incredible bathhouses. Then of course you shoot forward to 1964 and Charlie Gauthmey's house, very similar of these angled what's called monitor roofs. Again, mainly because of the architectural kind of just the geometric purity of these shapes. Someone who I really have fallen in love with over the years, Frances Breeze Miller. Did anyone here know Frances?
Yeah.
Tanty issues? You did, yeah, right. Kind of an amazing woman who grew up very tall, very independent, amazingly independent for that generation. That's the house, the orchard that Sanford White did for her father. So she grew up in this, she was a debutante, Southampton, the whole thing. Was sort of almost forced into this marriage with a boring Wall Street banker. And she kind of had a nervous break. I mean, she hated him, and she hated the life they were leading. So she kind of had a nervous breakdown, and then started to go to a European psychoanalyst, which is kind of the progression, the perfect progression towards a modern woman. And she really was. And so she grew up. Both her uncle and her father had this company called, what is it called again? Oh, BLM. I'm sorry, BLM. Breeze something Motors, and they wanted to compete with European race car designers and builders, and it didn't take off. But they had a couple of cars that did well in races. That is actually Tanti. That's Frances as the model in the car, because she was such a good driver. She was, and she raced all of these cars when she was like 12 years old, 15 years old. Kind of extraordinary woman. So then she goes 1930. Is that what I say? Yeah. 1930. She's going through this kind of breakdown. She's in analysis. She decides to go to Europe for the summer. She goes to Stockholm, and there's this fantastic exposition that Gunnar Asplund, a wonderful Swedish architect, designed with all this glass, and it's very minimal and it's very, very modern. And she was completely inspired. Came back and decided she was going to build her own beach house, not in Southampton, not in the estate section. So she bought a property in Bridgehampton, in an area where there was nothing. I mean, it was just potato fields coming down to the beach. No one built beach houses in Bridgehampton yet. And she built this wonderful house called the Sandbox. And it became I got to see it before it was torn. Unfortunately, it was torn down. Like, just so you know, between the time I first published the first edition in 2001 and this one in 2026, more than 26 or 7 of the houses that I featured in that book have been torn down. So that gives you an idea. It just doesn't work, because these waterfront lots, which cost very little when they were built on, are now $40 million or whatever. So, the idea of some hedge fund guy living in a 500 square foot little shack is highly unlikely. So anyway, this was an idea that she got from Asplund. She just hired a local guy, Lansing Holden, who, as far as I know, only did kind of faux Tudor-style suburban houses, but she showed him what she wanted, and he did this. It's beautiful. It was a beautiful, cool house. And she, at the same time, so she's liberating herself from the Wall Street guy. She's having psychoanalysis. She builds this house, starts this store in New York, and is doing all these are her rug designs. And she was the first textile designer for Knoll Fabrics, before Knoll even had a real fabric department. So she was just completely reinventing her life. She's an incredible woman. She wrote a 3-volume autobiography called Tanti. That was her nickname. This is just some shots I took when I got to visit. She created this floor. She painted it yellow and then just splatter painted it, way before Pollock had done a splatter paint. And that apparently it's done in either Portugal or somewhere that's like fairly common, to cover up an old wooden floor. And every inch was covered in shells, and it's a terrible photograph I took at the time of this rug that was supposed to be the sand dunes around the house, and it was this textile. You can barely see it there, but so everything was this sort of, just this ode to nature and ode to the beach. She swam, apparently she swam naked every morning, even off season in the winter, and the fishermen would gather around and wait for her to come in. These are stories. I don't know if they're true or not. Back to Percy Goodman quickly. This is an attempt he made to convince the Aluminum Corporation of America to back him into a series of these houses in Montauk, 1932. It's kind of an amazing project. It never got built, unfortunately. But it was going to be all aluminum. This is a house I literally discovered a month ago that was built in Riverhead. Jules Singer, sorry. I know nothing about this house. If anyone knows anything about it, please send me a note. And this, we were all fascinated by Myrtle Shepherd. Did anyone know Myrtle Shepherd? I'm trying to get you involved, guys. So Myrtle was another, she's not quite up to Tanty's Bree's level of independence, but she got divorced and then apparently built, and had quite a bit of money, and built this house on Dunmere Lane. I remember it well. It got sort of redone in the 80s, I think, but this is the first modernistic house in East Hampton. Unfortunately, it was torn down about 10 years ago, I think. I know nothing about her. I mean, I looked her up. There's a grave site, but that's about it. She came from the Midwest and settled in East Hampton for a while. At the same time, in Amagansett, this is in the library collection. This way I'm showing it because I love this when I came across this in the Long Island collection here. The original plan for Beach Hampton, in Amagansett, 1937. The R.B. Allen Development Company, and of course what's so sad about this, this was proposed in 37, it was built in 38, and then the beach club in the middle there, you can just see it kind of in the center. So it was this wonderful club right on the dunes. Then the 39 hurricane came and completely destroyed it. But now over the years, it's obviously Beach Hampton's become a very popular place. Post-war, here's my obsession with juxtaposing strange imagery because they're shaped the same. And this literally was an accident on my desk of the Pollock that just sold for, what is it again, 181 million, last week or 2 weeks ago at Christie's. I mean, it's a great painting, but and I'm not saying it shouldn't be. Maybe it's worth even more, I don't know. But the idea that the Queens Midtown Tunnel opened the last year of the war, and that Pollock moved out here to Springs the same year, I was thinking, okay, if I can connect this and talk about it to people and convince them that this is culturally relevant, then I've done a very good job. Well, it is sort of, so you got to hang with me for a sec. So this opened, and gradually Long Island is being developed more and more, and there's the entrance to the Queens Midtown Tunnel. And then you have this other group of artists who are coming to the opposite end, to the eastern end, because it's still so quiet. The light is beautiful, the landscape is low and flat and beautiful. And then somehow these two forces, and of course Pollock, who's completely unknown still, he's getting more and more famous, and of course when he finally gets in that car accident and dies, it's very famous, and you have these sort of two cultural things merging. You're not convinced, I can tell, but anyway. But what he did leave behind, and I find this one it's almost like a Pollock of a Pollock is the floor. Thank God they saved that and they rediscovered, because it's partly Lee Krasner. It's sort of the mix of their this is a great shot by Jeff Heatley. Apparently he got up into the rafters somehow and photographed, so he could get most of the photographs you see of it are just a little corner or a little part of it. But I love this. And I think it really, it's almost like an architectural landmark or monument. It's such an important, the time is right there, I see. So this is shifting over to the direct response. And what makes the Hamptons so different than, let's say, parts of Florida, Los Angeles, Chicago, even parts of Connecticut that had little dense concentrations of modern architecture, is this close convergence with the artists, with the avant-garde artists who were working here at the same time, because there was such a direct connection and influence. The sun was shining. This is Peter Blake, who comes out here for the first time. Mercedes Matters, who's very close friends with Pollock and is friends with Peter, takes him over to Pollock's studio. He's in the midst of this, one of these great paintings. The sun was shining in when I walked into his studio, shining in and into the painting. Sorry, it's hard to see. It was like walking into the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Dazzling, incredible. How a barn in Springs is like Versailles, it still amazes me, but that's Peter's imagination, going well. So very quickly they became buddies, and Peter proposed a museum. It's called the Ideal Museum, and that Pollock actually made the little paintings and actually made the little sculptures out of wire and plaster that you see here. This is Betty Parsons' gallery. It's a one-man show of Pollock in November 1949, and that's Peter on the right and Pollock on the left. And that's the first time it was shown. So the idea was just going to be this glass pavilion floating at the back. They wanted to build it at the back of Pollock's property overlooking Accabonac Harbor. There's an early shot of it. Pollock's paintings will be suspended between the earth and the sky and set between mirrored walls so as to extend into infinity. Wonderful. It'd be so cool if this was built. They did build a new model, because the original model was destroyed. And that's its set where it would have been built, in the back there, Pollock's property. Pollock-Krasner Study Center now, obviously. But wonderful idea. Just around the corner, you had Friedrich Kiesler, a German incredible artist and architect and everything, stage set, he did everything. Trying to make, again, he kept talking about the conventional house as a voluntary prison. So the idea of, coming out of so much of what the art was going on, the idea of like getting rid of conventional rooms, square rooms, square corners, right angles, it would like a Pollock painting would kind of flow into different zones. And these rooms were called nuclei, and he said that Kiesler said the endless house is called endless because all ends meet and meet continuously. Of course, it was never built. He built some of these huge models that are different museums around the world. And he was just around the corner. He was literally like, a quarter mile, half a mile from Pollock's studio, just in a barn there in Springs, same time. This is the house that got me kind of into really exploring this as almost a career, of wow, all this work that was happening. So this is a early shot of the Motherwell house in East Hampton. And again, it was incredibly simple. They didn't, he had more money than other artists. His father was a banker in California. Bob Motherwell's father was a banker. So he had a bit of money. He had enough money to buy a house in that area of East Hampton. And Chirot said, his friend Pierre Chirot said, well, you can buy a big Quonset hut kit for $100. So he bought 3 of them. And literally a week later, these trucks came and dumped all these bits and pieces on the lawn. Yeah. And then Chirot figured out how to make something more than just a Quonset hut. There's another shot of it. They went to the North Fork. There was a big industrial scale nursery that was going out of business. And that long glass sort of skylight wall along that side, it was the south side too. So the place burned to death in the summer, It was not well planned. But anyway, it brought all this wonderful light in for Motherwell's paintings. That's Motherwell himself, in the space inside. Really raw, rudimentary. All the pipes are painted, Alexander Calder red, because he was a friend. He came over and said, this place needs some color. So Motherwell said, well, where do you get that red? All your sculptures are so beautiful, that red. It's apparently a red that was made for coach detailing. These artists who would do these fine lines on coaches, on traditional coaches, and it's a special lead paint with red. So anyway, he got a couple of gallons of that and went to town. His first wife, Maria, who I'm really fascinated by because we don't know that much about her, but she was a very interesting artist in her own right. She was often modeled for, avant-garde photographers. This is her there, kind of with the cubist head. And the floor, which I love, that's a photograph I took literally right before the house was torn down. And I heard, I'm going to ask you this. I heard that Ruth Dingman, does that ring a bell? Ruth Dingman, does that ring a bell? Yeah? She kept her cocaine under one of these. Do you remember that? She didn't share? Okay. Sorry to embarrass you. I'm sorry. Yeah, which one? Well, when I was there, they were all pretty loose, because I've done this in my own house, actually. My son and I kind of figured it out. And you know, he basically was chopping all these cedar trees down and thought, well, it's kind of a waste. He wanted to put in Spanish tiles, but they were too expensive. He didn't have the budget. So he just had one of his guys chop these kind of tiles out of the cedar and then just set it in concrete. And had learned from some Japanese guy, because in Japan apparently they used to use this as a kind of a barn floor. And I couldn't figure out how to do it for the longest time. And then I realized he used a brush, a Japanese broom, and you put the concrete through it and over it, and then you broom the wet concrete away. Anyway, it makes a very beautiful floor. When he was there, you know, he really, I like to think the shape of the interior influenced him a little bit. You know, he did his first Spanish elegy paintings there, and really exploded as an artist with his first really dramatic collage pieces. Good friend Harold Rosenberg, the famous critic, you know, he and Rosenberg and Chirot and John Cage started this magazine called Possibilities that they put it together there. Very influential magazine. It had one issue and then went out of business, as such things do. Same period, and then of course Bob, he didn't like all these other artists being in the Hamptons, because he did come even before Pollock. He used to rent a place in Amagansett. So he moved up to the Cape, up to P-Town, you know, Provincetown. Meanwhile, Costantina Nivola and Ruth Nivola, who I'm sure a lot of people here know so well. I only saw this recently. It was in Catherine's guest house. This was a watercolor study that Tino did of his garden with all the different bits and pieces. He'd started the idea with a guy named Bernard Rudowski, a famous Austrian kind of architect theorist. And the idea was, instead of, again, like all these breaking down of the conventional house and the conventional room, the idea was to have what he called outdoor rooms. And you just, so here's one wall. There were these freestanding walls, even with a window in it. And there, unfortunately, the apple tree died, but one of the branches of the apple tree went through the window to the other side. It's a beautifully poetic kind of, yeah. And there's Ruth and Pietro and Claire and Tino on the right there. That's the outdoor kind of kitchen and living area. A lot of his meals were made there. Did I miss one there? Oh no. So on the right, you have, again, other freestanding walls that when they faded in the summer, you know, or from the winter exposure, he would just, you know, paint it white and then redo another design on it. So lovely. And just kind of this organic. Meanwhile, he's making all these new castings in the back in the sand. That's the fireplace in one iteration that I love. And you can see his guests are sitting around while he cuts up the striped bass and puts it on the grill. So beautiful. There's this solarium that he built so that even in the winter it was 4 walls, again, another room without a roof. And you climbed other steps. You climb up a ladder on the outside and they go in. Every wall had a mural on it, and you could lie there in the winter and have a suntan. Le Corbusier, I finally was able to find this photograph. I thought I'd lost it. He would stay with the Nivolas when he was working on the United Nations project with Wallace Harrison, and hated Wallace Harrison because Harrison wouldn't let him do whatever he wanted, because Le Corbusier arrived in New York thinking, I am the master and I will show you how it's done. The Assembly building is pretty much a Le Corbusier design. There he is having a wonderful European picnic, you know, on the Nivola lawn. And he got bored, you know. One week he was here, got bored, said, you guys need a mural by me in the house. He had his eyes on 2 walls. So that's a little sketch he quickly did, 1950, maquette. Yeah, probably a lot of you have seen this. It's in wonderful shape. It's been restored beautifully. That's him doing it, and that's kind of the end result of one side of it anyway. He was also learning from, that's Tino on the beach. You know, he started just doing sandcastles with his kids and then doing these castings with plaster right in the salty sand of the beach. And then that developed into his art form, which was really spectacular. And that's one of his classic, you know, that's a relief that he did for the Olivetti showroom that he did in the backyard there in Springs, 1954. He taught Le Corbusier how to do that. That's Corbett Barnstable Landing. So at low tide, you cut a kind of negative space in the sand and then pour in plaster or concrete and then let it set and bring it out. But of course the problem, and I've shown this in a couple of exhibitions, and now it's been secured, but it was just falling apart because the salt from the sand just undermined the integrity of the concrete. I had to get Bill de Kooning. You know, Bill never drove a car. I mean, he came out here. He started to come out. He first came out to stay with Pollock and Krasner, and obviously fell in love with it and started coming out more and more. But a very important period of his painting which is this sort of 54 to 59, 50, maybe 60 even. One of them is called Merritt Parkway, one of them is called Montauk Highway. I love to go out in a car, because he wouldn't drive himself, but his friends would drive him around. I'm crazy about weekend drives, he said. A highway in the metamorphosis of passing things. He talked a lot about this idea of a glimpse, when you have a glimpse of something and then you remember it and you try to track it down. So these weren't literal paintings, obviously, but they came out of that notion of between, again, that I'm going back to my original thesis of the Queen Midsound Tunnel, just if anyone's paying attention. Yeah, so he did, and he was going back and forth a lot, and then finally, obviously, build his own house, which he designed. He claims to have designed himself. I find it hard to believe. I think there was a builder who helped him, obviously. Tony Smith, who was also he was drinking buddies. That's Tony on the right with the beard, and that's Pollock. And they got drunk together, basically. The church that Osorio was going to build in the Philippines is on the left there. That was the design by Tony Smith. And it was going to have, every wall was going to have a Pollock on it. Originally, that was the idea, was this church. And but Tony did end up doing a wonderful house. It's still there, the last time I looked anyway, for Theodore Stamos, who was also an abstract expressionist painter. Again, kind of subverting the American house up on these stilts like a boat. So there are two roofs, there's one on the bottom, there's one on the top. Again, kind of disconnected from the earth and the landscape. Again, I don't mean to bore you with reading, but if this sort of is relevant at this point. If the canvas of the action painter, this is my English. If the canvas of the action painter became Harold Rosenberg's, quote, arena in which to act, then the new architecture would become an arena in which to experience the pure sensations of space, light, landscape, and nature, a kind of action architecture. In both paintings and buildings, the individual self became the primary subject, the primary view. The modern summer house would be placed in the middle of the composition, by the water's edge, on the crest of a dune, in the heart of a potato field, sometimes even in the water or the very edge of the water, instead of off to one side, upsetting the conventional figure-ground relationship that applied to both conventional architecture as well as painting. And you really see that begin to see that with Peter Blake's, coming out of his relationship with Pollock. This is his own house in Watermill. It was 24 feet by 24 feet. There's the model, 1953. And again, it's this beautiful idea. There's a collage, that he did of the concept and then built it. It was 4 barn doors on tracks that could be opened up like a pinwheel. And the whole concept originally arose from a conversation with Pollock. This is before Pollock was super big, and he said, you have to do paintings on the inside. So when the walls are all closed, the home dwellers surrounded by 4 Pollocks. Of course, Pollock started to get too successful, and that never happened. But again, here's sort of the action architecture. There's Peter Blake pulling open, pulling shut one of the big walls. Again, a house that can be open or closed in many different configurations, depending on the view, depending on the wind that day. He told me he survived one of the early, I guess it was 56, one of the really bad hurricanes. Carol, was it Carol, I think? Yeah, Carol, I think he survived Carol by, his wife and kids, went back to the city, and he just shut those walls and sat inside very nervously, but survived. So he didn't get Pollock, but there's an Osario painting on one of the walls, you know. And again, this sort of merging of the landscape, you know, and there's his wife watching their kids playing in the Temec-infused fields. I mean, it's terrible now, but what a beautiful concept. So easy, so light. No bedrooms there except for a tiny little basement room down a small staircase, and there were 2 or 3, I think just 2 bedrooms and a bathroom below there. So everything was about being open in nature, and then you'd sort of go down and sleep in it was a little bit like my parents' beach house. You go downstairs, like kind of concrete block. Always was mildewy, kind of damp. This is another house that he did in Montauk, the Armstrong house, wonderfully light, kind of very Japanese, you know, just so simple. His own house, second house, because his wife threatened to leave him in the Pinwheel house. So he did these 2, on the lower bit, it's the lower one is his house in Bridgehampton. It's 2 pavilions with this breezeway in between. And that's, of course, a lot of you probably knew this house, Gordon Bunshaft's house, you know, overlooking Georgica Pond in 1962. This is later, as you know, ravaged by Martha Stewart and some other people. I'm sorry, I have to get a dig in there when I can. Holiday House, George Nelson, who was kind of more known as a furniture designer, but he was, you know, he's a trained architect, was very clever because he was an editor at Holiday Magazine, which was super successful then. And he convinced them to let him build, you know, buy property and build a house called the Holiday House in Quogue. And that's it in the magazine. That's a shot of it in the magazine. And again, it wasn't a conventional house at all. It was a bunch of these little kind of pavilions, open air pavilions that could be closed a little bit in the winter, shut down. But you just go from room to room. It's very much about the weekend warrior, you know, getting away from the city, arriving and just sort of being as close to nature as possible. Here's another project he did for out here, never built, but literally stepping down these pavilions with these sort of domed roofs, stepping down into the bay, you know, to the actual. So the final one in the water there is where you go and you change, and then you dunk down into the water. And this house is still one of my favorite houses. It still exists. The Lewis House out in Mouse Point.
Gerard Drive?
Gerard Drive. Yeah. No, not Gerard Drive, the other side, Last Point, yeah. And it doesn't look the same, but this is 54. This is the cover of American Home Magazine. Robert Rosenberg was really a very good architect who unfortunately died quite young. He was the first serious modern architecture to move out here and try to make a living. He'd run Marcel Breuer's office in New York. And this is a house, Mr. Lewis, very nice guy. He invented kind of bifocal cameras, you know, stereoscopic cameras. And then the plan for this is just wonderful. So that on the right is 4 tiny bedrooms, you know, with bunk beds. And that was kind of the dormitory. Then the living area is just, again, it's still the same. You know, 24 feet by 24 feet, exactly the same as Peter Blake's house. That was a conventional modular sort of shape because the idea was you could go to the lumber yard and just order 8-foot 2x4s, 4x8 plywood sheets, and they didn't even have to cut it. You just put it together. That never worked out, but that was the no, it didn't, because you always had to cut something. But that was the concept, that you would just go to a regular, nothing special, everything really inexpensive. This is something that I only learned about. After the first edition of the book, someone said, "Why didn't you have the John Snyder house in the book?" I said, "Because I don't know what that is." And it was on Shelter Island. John Snyder was a real character from Chicago who was promoting the idea of recycling railroad cars for housing. So this was his prototype, and this is what it looked like from the side. And he said in a very, emphatic way, he wrote this whole little pamphlet about it, similar wheelless railroad coaches will soon be sticking their vestibules into the water at every seaside resort in America, said John Snyder. There wasn't another one built but this one. But it's quite fantastic. So the house, on the landward side is very nice, quite a conventional kind of Marcel Breuer type summer house. And then he had to show off this amazing thing, cantilevered out over the water. It was 2 railroad cars, and then it was the guest. So if you were a guest, you got to stay at that end right in that sort of observation platform. But what a fantastic structure. Who'd ever build that today? Apparently that part has been either collapsed or torn down, but part of the more normal part of the house is still there, and parts of it are. This is my friend Andrew Geller, who died a few years ago. He was a super discovery with the first show we did called Long Island Modern. He had been a designer for Raymond Loewy. He did everything from shopping centers to cameras to car parts. He was an extraordinary guy, very quiet, very self-effacing. Raymond Loewy would always who was a big blustering character, would take credit for everything Andy Geller did. And I didn't know much about him. I knew he'd done this stuff for Loewy, and I went and visited him in Northport. His wife met me at the door and said, "He's been waiting for you for 30 years," which I thought was lovely. So I went in, we sat down, we had a tea, we had a nice tea party. And one after the other, he dragged out these incredible models and drawings. There's some of the models we had in the show. And he, on the weekends, he'd work like a slave all week in Loewy's office, corporate office in New York. Then he would build for his friends, who were just regular people like him. He would design these houses for nothing. Some of these houses were like, this is the famous one, right? Pearlroth House in West Hampton Beach, 1958. This cost something like $10,000, I think, when it was built. And it's tiny. It's absolutely tiny. Anyway, and this was beautifully restored recently. This is one of the few, apart from the 28 that were torn down, this is one of the few really wonderful success stories. Anyway, he was amazing, and because he designed Liberty ships during World War II, so he had this incredible talent to just fit things in, nooks and crannies, find space where no one else would find space. So this house has storage and shelving and all these kind of crevices, and wonderful. It's a wonderful place. And that's the ultimate, bachelor pad beach house. It was for Esquire magazine. I mean, it was kind of a joke. It was a joke. We're trying to actually build a version of this at Longhouse. $3,000. It could be folded up. It came with, in the advertising, it came with a bottle of gin and it was for, the wolf. It was the Esquire Playboy aesthetic, right? It was the wolfy guy who would lure whatever girl walking along the beach up that ladder, and then you could bring the ladder up and then shut everything up. And I take no credit for it. I'm purely sociologically interested in this moment. But it's such a great concept. I mean, it's obviously ad absurdum, but it's wonderful. Paul Lester Wiener, I know I'm running out of time, and Ingeborg Tenef, who I'm sure other people know here too. Such a great photograph. I only found this recently. I mean, she was such an interesting. They were both so glamorous and interesting. And they were living in one of Jeffrey Potter's cottages in the back there, where my sister and I actually met Marilyn Monroe one summer. Amazing. Marilyn, she's such a close friend. I call her Marilyn. I was tiny, but apparently, according to my sister, Marilyn offered us Coca-Cola, which made my mother really angry because we weren't supposed to drink Coke. That's my only memory of Marilyn Monroe. But those cottages were wonderful, and Ingeborg and Wiener, Paul Wiener, rented one of them. Yeah, amazing guy. So this is Beatrice Babs Simpson's wonderful house. I have no idea what shape this is in now. Babs died. Babs lived to like 104 or something. She only died a few years ago. She was an editor at Vogue, very chic, wonderful. I mean, the place was amazing. When I took I was writing a story about it, and I took a New York Times photographer around, and he was kind of a clumsy guy, and we kind of walk in, and she had around the garden, with all this espalier, wonderful stuff on the walls, she had these, instead of tiles, she had perfect squares, and one square would be white gravel, and the next square would be, it was a checkerboard with black gravel, but it was perfectly brushed gravel. And this clumsy New York Times photographer stumbled, and some of the black gravel flew into the white gravel square. And it was just minuscule little and Babs Simpson was like, practically threw us out on the spot. it was just a wonderful moment of like, that's how much she cared. And the house was just in perfect shape. Some of you probably knew Robert Scull. I mean, talk about a prosperous Bohemian. Here we go. And Paul Wiener did this wonderful house room that's just been recently, as some of you know. Lisa Perry did a wonderful job restoring this house. This is his wife. I mean, their divorce was like front page Daily News, controversy. Andy Warhol's wonderful portrait of her, Ethel Scull 36 times in 1963. They were huge collectors of Warhol, and I think when they finally auctioned off the Scull's collection, it was I think it was the first time $1 million. Yeah, I think it was the first time a Warhol went for $1 million. This is how it looks now after it's now own a house for women's art. It's beautifully done. I mean, this is one of those great stories. Paul would do these very Japanese style large hovering roofs, with very simple glass pavilions underneath. That's Elizabeth de Cueva's house, with one of Elizabeth's sculptures in the foreground. Again, very simple square pavilion with this big hovering thing. I'm glad I can get to this. I will stop in about a minute. This is a novel that came out at this period in the 60s, same period. Geraldine Trota. The house was ringed and mist when they got back. I mean, it's sort of like a Gatsby of the 60s, 50s. It was about a beach house in Bridgehampton in 1956. There were 3 different couples, and they were all going through divorce, and they were all, having naughty times with each other. And God, I sound like a kindergarten teacher. And the house itself became this, almost like, Gatsby's green light. The house was ringed in mist when they got back. It's all about martinis, too. They're constantly knocking back martinis, having these terrible fights and wandering off. And what's wonderful at the end of the novel, it's a pretty terrible novel, but it's so much about this period. At the end of the novel, the hurricane, whatever the hurricane in 54 or 56 was, Carol or one of those, wipes the house out and kills one of the people. Anyway, the house was ringed in mist when they got back, rising romantic and unreal from the vapors. A light shone from somewhere inside it, a hesitant yellow in the hollow hull of an enormous lantern. I just love that. I'm going to quickly skip through this, even because I'm going to actually speak about this couple, Julian and Barbara Nesky, wonderful architects. Not well known enough because they were very innovative. This is a house on Turbo Lane, just over here, which I hear is being saved. I mean, there was threat of it being demolished. 1964, very early. I just have to skip. This is their house down in Amagansett, the Gorman House. Again, going back to very simple, almost like those beach cabana type architecture, with these different courtyards and. For sunning, and very simple but very complex at the same time. That's one of the courtyards. That house is still there, the Gorman House. This is their famous Kate's house, which was 3 Sullivanian therapists who shared the house. I'm going to fly through this, but this is the floor plan. The bedroom in the middle was the woman's. Then the bedrooms on either side were her ex-husband on one side and her new lover on the other. This is true. I mean, so the Sullivanians were kind of a cult, kind of free love cult. And then the children from different marriages were in that dormitory in the bottom. It's such a great floor plan. And then at the end, you see that's the nursery. That's the poor maid who had to look, the nurse who had to look after the kids, where God knows what was going on in those tiny bedrooms. And it's a tiny house, as bare and minimum and Spartan as you can be. It's very Le Corbusier. Anyway, and Barbara's stories, unfortunately Barbara passed away last year, her stories about these clients are just hysterical. They weren't really included in, I'm not going to do the 60s because I've run out of time apparently. Andrea, right? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So I'll just then this whole new group like Charlie Gwathmey and Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman came along in 70, 71. Charlie's great beautiful cardboard model for his parents' house. And that really changed everything. Things got much more vertical. They weren't those sort of horizontal, low-lying pavilions anymore. mainly because the land on the beach was getting too expensive, so a lot of people were buying further back. This house is on Bluff Road, and the idea was to get high enough to get a view of the ocean, as was Richard Meyer's famous Saltzman house, which I'll just jump through to. That house is almost nothing on the ground level. It was all about that second level to get the ocean view. I'm gonna go. I want to end on something funny. You can see how long it was going to go on for. Okay, let's end on that. Jay Hoop's wonderful. That was after the Great Nor'easter of 1992. A wonderful photograph of West Hampton Beach. So thank you very much, and